Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Dublin Data Science. My name is Flavia. I am from Dogpatch Labs, and we are proud to be hosting another Dublin Data Science meetup. So, just a quick talk to you guys before I pass it on to Mick. If you guys have any question, I think it's this side, there's an Ask a Question button here. You can just send your question to the box, or you can use the chat too. Mick's gonna be moderating the chat while Fiona is presenting, and you can also use it to talk to the other attendees. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it on to Mick, and enjoy.
Thanks, Flavia. Well, thanks everyone for coming for the June edition of Dublin Data Science. So kind of with COVID and all that and everything going online, our standard kind of steady pipeline of speakers that we get by going to the pub and arresting people and basically saying, that sounds great, give us a talk, has dried up. So we've kind of reduced our schedule down to about once a quarter. And I'm certainly there won't be any more crowdcast talks. It'll probably be my workshops for July and August, but I'm pretty sure we have a talk lined up for September. And then depending on how things work, we may have a couple of more talks before the end of the year rather than going back to workshops. So it's great to have a talk. It gives me a month off and it gives you a chance to use Dublin Data Science to listen to someone other than me. So tonight I'm delighted to have Fiona McGroarty talking. She's an old colleague of mine from, not that long ago, because she's quite a young woman still. Nice of age in there, Fiona. Did you see how I did that? Yeah. So Fiona and we worked together on a couple of occasions actually, and we were having a conversation. I've been trying to get her to talk for a while, and the idea I had for her to give a talk was basically the idea. So one of the things kind of data scientists are often accused of, and I think it's a very valid accusation, is that we don't really take into account how the model is used, but also how it's going to be effectively productionized. So like it's all very well and good having a highly predictive model, but if it's actually incredibly cumbersome or takes like 12 hours to produce a forecast when you need a forecast every hour, that's not really much use to you. So Fiona's been working for the past, since 2014, I think, Fiona, is it, in banking?
Yeah,
was it or 16 or 15? I can't remember. Quite a while in financial services, and she's been very much at the coalface of all the issues around what do you do once you have a model you're happy with, and like dealing with stakeholders and people who aren't technical, and also just getting it in a way that, like, how often do we refit the model? How much reliability do we put into it? All those kind of things. Now, I'm not trying to spoil it because I haven't seen the slides. I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say, because I know she has quite a lot of interesting insights. So I'm going to take it away. Just to let the format know, we have a chat channel here on your right, and we also have an ask a question down the bottom. I'm going to be pretty heavily monitoring both. So if any of you have any questions or anything like that, put them into the chat, put them into the ask a question. If it's something that's very immediate, I'll probably try and interrupt politely, and get the question asked if it's relevant. But if there's something like a bit more expansive or longer, I'll probably give you the opportunity to answer it, Fiona, but it maybe will get addressed at the end or whatever. Yeah. But by all means, I mean, the chat is there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come off now and turn off my video, but I'll be probably selectively muting and unmuting purely just to get a bit of a conversation going, because one thing we have heard from our other speakers is that it can be quite difficult to just talk to a blank screen for an hour with no feedback whatsoever. So yeah, I'm going to be effectively monitoring the chat and the questions. We have a couple of polls there. By all means, answer them. And yeah, and then so I'll be kind of, the voice of the people, so to speak, for the night. And by all means, ask away. And then once at the end it will come up, we'll do some wrap up. It usually takes, for those, I know there's a few new faces tonight, it usually takes about an hour. We'll be expecting to wrap up around 8 o'clock. So just in time for kickoff of the third match in the Euros, which I know Fiona's mad to get off to watch. So yeah. Have you gotten control? Have you lost your remote control, by the way, Fiona? For the
no, I think I have it.
Oh,
is there an echo when I speak?
No.
Okay.
No, you're good. Excellent. All right, so I will hand over to Fiona, and yeah, we'll on. I'm not. What was the title? Analytics at scale.
Analytics. Can you see my slides?
Now we can.
Now you can. Okay. Sorry, there is an echo, and it's driving me mad. Any ideas how I get rid of it?
Are you logged onto the browser twice?
I don't think so.
Make sure there isn't another panel of stuff there. That often happens.
Okay, I'll have a look.
Because they'll be slightly async, and you'll have a slight echo.
Yeah, okay. I have an echo. I'm going to try and work through it. I don't know what's causing it. I wasn't here earlier. Okay, thanks.
No problem.
As Mick said,
Let me just check if it's.
Is it gone? Is it you? You've muted Mick, have you?
I have, yeah. Was it coming off me?
It might have been. Mute again now, see. Okay. No, it's not you. You're all right. Okay, so as Mick said, I've been working in a number of financial institutes. Take her headphones. Can you hear me?
We can't hear you now, Fiona.
Well, it wouldn't be a meetup without some kind of technical issue. Don't worry. My entire screen froze for 10 minutes in the last workshop. It was great. Sorry, 2 workshops ago. You're muted at the moment, Fiona.
Can you try and unmute yourself from your side, Fiona? Because I can't. Yeah. No, not yet.
You've muted again.
Do you want to try disconnect to connect your phone again? Your headset.
Yeah, you're coming up on auto mute. Which can you hear us, Fiona? And we can actually see the mute icon on your video stream. So
if you want to check if you're muted on Crowdcast, and try and mute yourself from Crowdcast, maybe.
it's if you hover over the little window where you can see your video, Fiona, you'll get a little kind of pop-up screen, which should have a microphone icon and a video icon.
If you click, yeah, just pass the mouse in front of your video on Crowdcast. Huh. I'm gonna invite you to join the screen again. 1 sec.
I have this strange urge to start humming like elevator music. Do 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 do. I'm reminded of that scene at the end of the Blues Brothers when they're waiting to pay their bills.
Fiona?
Yes.
There we go.
Yes.
Okay. The echo is still there, but I'm just going to try and live with it. Okay. Can you see my screen?
No, you need to share again.
Yeah, you need to share. Hi, Raphael. How are you? Oh, I'm Patrick. You're all very welcome.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. So 3rd time lucky. So as Mick said, I've been working in financial institutes for the last number of years, and I've joined most of them at a time where they're just kind of getting interesting. They've started going from a position where they have models in development, and they move to a point where they want to do this analytics at scale. So they try and scale up. And I've been lucky to kind of come in at that point. So in terms of a challenge, it's been really, really interesting. For the most part, there's been a lot of things to learn, and that's kind of what you're going to get a summary of here today. Like there are many, many, many different paths to production for different models, and also paths for production in terms of devising an infrastructure that you want to use to productionize your models. What you're getting here is a summary of kind of how it's worked in a number of places I've been. Some things we tried that worked, some things we tried that didn't work, some things that were suggested and never implemented, some things that came up in discussion with consultants, but for one reason or another were never implemented, and some things that have come up from conferences that I've been to about kind of this whole area. So you're not getting a flavour of how it's worked anywhere that or how it currently works anywhere that I am. So for example, I'm not showing you how we do it in Bank of Ireland. I'm kind of giving you more a flavour of how it's done in general. There's a lot to cover in the area. I'm going to cover a couple of things Mick has mentioned. There's a couple of things you mentioned, Mick, that I haven't got covered, so I might try and throw in a couple of comments about that as we go. There's not too many slides. There's a kind of about 10 or 11 slides, so probably a good bit of time for chat. So feel free to
don't worry if there's stuff you don't cover in the slides.
And if it is something I'm about to address in the next slide, I will just say, hang on a second and see if this answers your question. But if not, we're happy to chat. So as Mick mentioned, I'm working in Bank of Ireland at the moment. So in our customer analytics department, which kind of focuses more so on marketing models. So models that determine who's the best customer to contact and what's the best thing to contact a customer about. So look, I'm going to make a start before I mess up audio or something again, and we'll see how this goes. So.
Don't worry, Fiona.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 3 points at the top. So they are kind of what can you automate? Okay, so I've called out data preparation, model building, model scoring. They're the kind of things you can automate. I'm just going to touch on them. I'm not going to talk about them too much, but I'm happy to kind of expand on that when we get to questions. The bit I was going to try and focus a little bit more on were the 3 points at the bottom. So, how do you use your production environment? And this kind of term of analytics at scale, which has been kind of a big thing for the last number of years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the typical journey, and I have put that in quotes for a reason. There is no typical journey, but I've kind of summarized like a high-level overview of what a typical journey might look like to get you from your data science team working in development to a point where you think, hang on, I think we need a production environment, and what does that look like? The last bit then I've kind of got here is a bit about the development and production teams and how they work together on a day-to-day basis in terms of who looks after what and where the divisions of responsibilities and where the overlaps. So that's what I'm going to go through. Okay, so the first bit was, why would you bother productionizing? Okay, why do you think this is going to help? So I've called out a couple of things and now this whole talk I will tell you is from the point of view of a data scientist, because that's what I am. I will talk quite a bit about the production environment and the roles of production, but it's probably from the data scientist point of view. So for anyone who is here who is working in a production environment, this is probably how we see you rather than how you see us. But the reasons you might want to productionize, firstly, is scheduling. Now, you can still schedule without being in a production environment, but it makes the whole thing a lot easier. So if you want to schedule for your models to run in a batch schedule, so at a certain frequency, it is much easier to do that in a production environment. Not just the scheduling itself, but all of the dependencies that you need to run before your model can run. So if you need certain data, or you need certain data transformed, or you need one model to run it before another model runs, all of those kind of dependencies tend to be much better handled in a production environment. It's kind of what it's for. But it also means then if you have developers, they're not spending their time manually running models because that can be quite time intensive. Kind of related to that, you get a reliability advantage from productionizing. So your model scores are going to probably be written to a production environment. This is a fairly safe environment. It can't easily be deleted or overwritten, or at least if you set it up right, it can't easily be deleted or overwritten. And access is restricted based on who actually needs access. So you've got control over where your scores are being used purely from having it in a production environment. Now, to be honest, you probably have that if you're just working in a development environment too, because chances are that's going to be restricted as well. But if you're working in a development environment, you need to then, oh, sorry, Mickey, sorry. Hi, Mickey.
Can you hear me now, Fiona?
Yes, sorry,
Oh.
I turned down this because the
You
echo
muted
was
me,
driving me
did you?
mad. Yeah, sorry.
That's fine.
No, not the first time.
Is there echo still with me? Is there?
It's me. I can hear myself. I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
When I'm echoed, is it muting me gets rid of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think
Well,
I'm
tell you
just
what.
doing it wrong.
Yeah, let me mute myself and normally, and then I'll unmute myself when I have a question.
Perfect.
That hopefully that'll solve that problem. Yeah.
Grant.
I was just going to ask. First of all, a couple of things. One is, I think the rest of you heard. Don't worry about if there's any you don't cover that I mentioned. Don't worry, I'll ask you at the end. That'll be fine. We'll cover it then. But secondly, when it comes to scheduling, you were talking about running the models. So, just one thing that strikes me is, do you draw a distinction, and if so, how big of a distinction between running the model from a predictive point of view, as in, creating new predictions, and running the model in terms of refitting the parameters of the model?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I've a bit at the end about that whole refitting in terms of the parameters. So usually when we build a model, we build it, we test it, we evaluate, we sign off, and then the model goes live, and then it'll get scored regularly. Right? So that could be every month, say. And we will just let it score until it starts to not perform well anymore. And at that point, we'll consider refitting it then. But up until that point, it just scores. It's on a schedule and it'll continue to score unless it falls over or we decide we want to stop scoring because it's not performing.
And how do you decide about that performance?
Ideally, you have some monitoring that's going to look at things like how many people are scored every time, because that volume should not change too much. Okay, so you'd have a threshold of how much it can change before we decide we need to look into it.
So as in, let's say you have 100,000 customers that you're running your model on. Let's just say it's some kind of propensity to purchase a product, and you have 100,000 customers. So you basically, let's say you run the model every week, and you check how that score is changing. Is it?
Yeah. So the first thing you would check is how many are scored for a start. So if you're expecting about 100,000 to be scored, and every month you scored, it's about that, and then you scored this month, and there's only 10,000 scored, something's gone wrong.
Something. And why would there be less?
In this case, it could be if there's a data issue downline. So, for example, one of your criteria is that you have to have an age between whatever X and Y, and your age field has been corrupted. Okay, so nothing to do with your model.
Yeah,
but that's
right.
And that can catch quite a few problems because there's a whole area about data where it's not your data, but it's going to impact you if it goes wrong.
Yeah.
So that's one of the first things.
Yeah, but like, so it's the classic thing of when you load a table, check the number of rows.
Exactly.
It's basically that, like, simple stuff. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. And then the other thing you would probably check is your distribution of scores. So if you expect a typical distribution, and that can be whatever it is for your particular model, then if the score distribution changes on one of your scoring periods, you want to go and look at it then as well. And ideally, you want to look at those scores before they go out to downstream user. Okay, whatever your downstream users are. So that example of trying to build a model that's going to say who's going to want this particular product. If your scoring hasn't gone well and that your scores are completely changed from what you'd expect, you'd want to catch that before your downstream users use it, say, to go out and start ringing people saying, do you want this product? So that's something you would hopefully catch as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later.
Cool. I mean, and I'll ask the question now so I don't forget it. But if you deal with it later, because this is exactly the kind of stuff I want to talk about. So the first thing that strikes me there is the great thing about productionizing is that you can automate all the things. However, the problem with automating all the things is that everything's automated, which I know sounds like a tautology, but the problem there is, how do you bring the human back into the loop to interrupt the process to go, we used to score 10,000 of the 100,000 that were actually high propensity to purchase, and now we're getting 25,000. So obviously something's gone wrong, or now we've only got 3,000. So how do you put the human back in the loop to prevent those being pushed downstream the way you've just, or is that something you're going to talk about later?
I am going to talk about it later. Perfect. So I might come back to it then. But it's great that you're thinking that way, because my whole point about later is that that's something that usually comes up as a kind of well down the line idea. Somebody goes, oh, how do we do that? once you've already done all your productionization.
So I've said this before and I'll say it again, and I'm delighted for it. Like because of my background in quantitative finance, the whole thing of automated trading has those classic stories of guys like vaulting over tables to pull power sockets out to shut down the servers because they were sending out, literally tens of thousands of orders a second and costing the company. Like that's how Knight Capital lost 400 grand in one day. But in that one day, they only traded for half an hour and 40 minutes in 2 separate periods. So the whole bringing the human back in, is definitely something that I think about quite a bit. But I'm going to go on mute now to stop you going mad from listening to the echo.
Thank you very much. So I've muted you again, Mick, but as soon as I see your microphone unmute, I'll turn you back up. Okay, so so the other thing I had here was about reliability. Okay, we've talked a little bit about that. Backups goes hand in hand with reliability, your dev environment, and only if you've lost stuff from a dev environment in a big company and asked for them to back it up, will you find out that they are not in a hurry to back up a dev environment, whereas your production environment, if something goes down, it'll get back up pretty quick. And the last thing I have then is a bit about governance. Now, this is usually a bit of an afterthought, especially if it's your first time in a production environment, which if you're setting it up wherever you are probably is. But it's usually something, and like this will change from industry to industry. Some industries need more governance. Some areas of different industry need more governance. Where we work in customer analytics. There's not as much governance as there would be for the likes of risk models, which are calculating probability of default and therefore whether or not people get loans or mortgages or what rates they pay and all that kind of stuff. So they would have much stronger governance than we have. But even still, what I have found is as you move from a purely development environment into a production environment, you end up having better governance. Okay, it's not a bad thing. And I found it's particularly useful in data science where there's a lot of movement of people. Staff move around quite a lot. You might have a good process. Somebody new comes in, you've hired them because they're good, but they don't know how you do things. And if you don't have good governance, you end up with a load of different models that every time somebody else has to go and review or fix or change, they have to basically learn how it's done because they've all been done differently. So all of that kind of sums together to give you analytics at scale. So the idea that your production environment, it's brought in to allow your developers to do analytics at scale, as into with the aim that they will be able to develop much more quickly because all that manual production type stuff that they were doing of manually running the model is been done by your production environment. So that's the idea. Okay, what can you productionize? So, and now this, you could talk for an hour on this alone. What I picked are kind of the three main things that I've seen being productionized and the three things it's useful to productionize. So one is the models themselves. So you productionize them. That means you schedule them to run at a certain frequency. You schedule all of their dependencies, data or other model or whatever. You schedule where they're going to be written. So you don't have your developers running the model and then creating a CSV that gets dropped into another location for somebody else to pick up. And there's emails going back and forth, did you create it? And then that guy goes on holidays and nobody knows how to create it. So all of this just kind of gets rid of all of that, all of those risks really that are likely to potentially go wrong or get missed or forgotten about. The other thing you can add to productionize, and this really depends on your environment, whether you productionize it in the same environment as you productionize your models, but that's your data. So you will have a kind of aggregated data, which is often quite useful for data scientists. So you don't care about individual transactions or individual balances potentially, but what you do care about is the total amount. That can be often far more useful for propensity models. So any data that's aggregated or frequently used. Okay, so you can have, if you're just in a purely development environment, maybe I create a script this time and I create a variable called age, and that's somebody's age calculated from the date of birth to today. And then Mick takes it because he thinks that's quite useful to have, but for some reason he needs it in months rather than years. He also calls it age, and then somebody else takes it and they want an age band where you're put into kind of a band of 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, but they call it age as well. And now we've got three fields called age. And if somebody refers to age, they've got three different versions of it. So I can see you're there, Mick, hang on.
Yeah. And don't forget, Fiona, at some point then there's an age that's minus 3.47.
Oh, yeah.
That's always a good one too.
Yes. Why wouldn't there be?
Yeah. But, I mean, sorry, I had a serious point as well. So the data one is something I'm particularly focused on because it's a very hard problem to solve. Because to a certain extent, if you're going to snapshot and put governance around your model and your model code, it's so codependent with the data and the data structure that you almost need to put version control around your data as well. And like models and code is easy because we use Git now or Mercurial or whatever, generally Git, and essentially source code control has effectively solved that problem, but it doesn't work well for data. So I'm curious, have you came across how, or is that even done, or is it just the technology, like it's not a solved problem, so people kind of bodge it together in whatever best way they can?
Yes. So what I've seen used quite well is having your data aggregated into like a big customer analytic record. So it's one row per customer, and then that gets created every month or week or whatever frequency you're working at. So you might have, say, customers' balance at the end of every month. You might have the total transactions they've had in that month. So it's aggregated at that level. And then there's kind of a period date with each row per customer. So you could look and see how a customer's balance has changed over the past kind of 12 months if it's done at monthly level. So that doesn't have a version with it as such, but there is an associated issue, and this kind of might be what you're getting at, which is that you've got this customer analytic record and you're using it, and then you want to put a new aggregated data field in there.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever money was put aside to create this production data table, that's run out, and nobody thought about how you would put these new fields in.
The budget.
The budget is a pain. And that can be a big problem. And that's one, like, we had an idea at one stage somewhere I worked that we would have this kind of light version of that table. So if I created a useful feature and it turns out to be useful in your model as well, it gets added to this light table. So you can pull some of your data features from the actual real production table, and you pull the rest of them from this light table, and then every quarter or half year, it gets merged in with the main one. That didn't work. In theory, it worked brilliantly, but just, again, funding. So that can be a really big issue. And it's something, again, that doesn't get thought about because we think about how to set it up. We don't think about maintenance. And that's a point I have at the end, because it's going to affect your production system, whether it's just models or the data as well.
And before I go on mute, I have a question here from Greg. He says, do you account for data set drift as a whole or by entity? Which is a great question.
I guess definitely not by whole, because it depends on what model you're building. So if I have one model which is going to predict who wants, say, a personal loan, the data that's in there might be quite different to the data set that I use for the model for who wants a mortgage.
Right.
So what we tend to do is we create our models. You know what features you're going to use. So you might have hundreds of features available to you, but each model is going to pick the maybe 20 features that are useful for it. So your data that's in this personal loan model is going to be very different to the data that's in your mortgage model. So this comes back into that monitoring that I mentioned at the Nick's last question. So one of the things we'll do is look at the input features as well as the output scores. So you look at the input features and you see how much do they move. Okay, so we use a population stability index test. If they move a lot, we would probably go and look at it. If they don't move too much, it's probably fine. If it does move a lot and we want to go look at it, it's going to depend on, it could be a feature that's moved quite a bit, but it's the lowest importance of your model and your scores haven't been impacted, so that's okay. It could be a feature that's changed a lot, and it's the top feature in your model and your score distribution has changed completely, and that's then an investigation.
Yeah, and I guess the problem is it could be correct, right? I mean, it could be literally that you now have a whole lot of, there was some marketing campaign and suddenly the profile that you're targeting has now changed because some certain demographic is now up 25% on year. So your distribution of input values are different, and that's why your output scores are different.
Yeah, definitely. That's one. Seasonality is another big one. We've had models that have halted in scoring because it looks like the distributions have changed completely. You go in, you look at the model, you look at the top features, and you realize it's a feature that's likely going to be impacted by seasonality. You test it, you check it, and you look and you see that's exactly what's happening. And then you let the model go on and scores continue.
Right. Okay. Cool. I'll go back on mute.
Okay. Okay, so the last one I have then, oh, sorry, I had a bit about data then. Standardizing the data, that was the bit where I mentioned where we've got 4 different versions of the variable age and nobody knows exactly which one they're using. The last one I have then is monitoring, which you'd mentioned earlier, Mick. So I'd said later in the process, this is something that's usually not people's first focus when you're setting up a production environment. It probably should be higher on the list, but it never is. At some point you're going to want evidence of whether the models are working or not. Okay, now if you're in the kind of environment that I'm in at the moment where your model is used to predict who you should contact and say, hey, do you want a loan or whatever, you are going to want evidence. So there will definitely be people shouting for evidence of whether or not that's working. But it's good to know, regardless of what your model's being used for, it's good to know, is the model working? Is it predicting who we thought it would predict? And all that monitoring piece there about looking at the inputs and the outputs and how are they, is the distributions changing over time? If yes, is it how we expected? If yes, is it too big? The change is too big. Do we need to go back to the model? Do we need to change the data? All that kind of stuff. That monitoring is much better if you can kind of plan for it and build it out and have it ready to go, rather than having an absolute panic when somebody comes and says, this appears not to be working. And you're sitting there going, it was good when I built it. I don't know what's happened. I do think it tends to be an afterthought. If you said it to somebody who's setting up a production environment, they would probably agree it was very useful. However, it's probably the last thing that will be funded. And a bit more on this. You're gonna tell from this that this is a bit of a bugbear of mine.
Yeah, and I don't know if I've turned up, Fiona, but if you can hear me, this is not a problem that cross-validation will solve.
No. This is, you've done your validation, you've done your evaluation, your model's good. Yeah. It's over time, and all models will degrade. That's kind of the thing about them. Your only hope is that they degrade slowly enough that you're not looking at rebuilding them very regularly.
Well, in my experience, even if you have a regular, so I had when I was doing the finance stuff, I was producing forecasts daily, but I was refitting the model every month, and that was kind of, it would be a very strong statement to say that was automated, but it was kind of semi-automated, and even that was something that you still have to look at from time to time. Even if you're refitting your model on a semi-regular basis to kind of keep it fresh, your model is still going to degrade, because the things that are impacting on it will change over time, and people will behavior, like their behavior will change, and that will, sometimes in response to the models you're using.
I was just going to say that's kind of a big impact in the moment. We're so dependent on customer behavior for the kind of models that we're building. And yet people's financial customer behavior has changed so much with COVID. So we have models that were built pre-COVID. Do they still apply in COVID times? That's what we're looking at.
I'm willing to guess that restaurant expenditure and pub expenditure has gone through the floor.
Funnily enough, it has.
Globally.
But then we have a problem now. There's new models we want to build right now, but we're still kind of in COVID times. So if we build them now, chances are we're going to have to retrain them in 6 months' time, especially if things continue to keep opening. So it's an added headache. Like, this would be here anyway, but this doesn't make it easier.
And I have a question here. Are you always able to quantify model effectiveness? That's from Greg.
Okay, model effectiveness. The question people ask us is campaign effectiveness. Right, so we don't run campaigns, but we build models that are used in campaigns, and people want to know, did the campaign work? The model is part of that, but as well, you've got the model, you've got whatever message went out to the customer, you've got the proposition itself. Okay, so it could be a great model, identify people who want a loan, the message is sent out, and the interest rate is incredibly high. Nobody's going to buy that. But, that's not the model. So there is often that campaign effectiveness that tends to be measured. Okay, people put money into that. What we do is we also measure the models separately. So we say, regardless of whether they were contacted, did we guess the right people? So if you look at the people who were scored high, what percentage of them took out the product, right? Regardless of contact. And we do the same for the kind of who were scored medium and low as well. And that's how we prove our model. So we'll go back and we'll say, like, the campaign worked great, excellent, so did our model. We kind of say that was a strong part of it. But if the campaign didn't work great, but we can still prove the model worked well, then we say, well, look, there's a problem with something else, some other element of the campaign. So To answer your question, Greg, what we do is we look and we see of people who were scored in a certain date, how many of them subsequently took out the product. And ideally, that percentage is higher for the people who are scored high, and then it drops down as you kind of look through the lower propensities.
And a great way to cause a political shitstorm is to then judge that against contact or not contact in the campaign.
Yeah.
That's a great way to cause a fight.
You need to do it sometimes. But yeah, there are so many elements. You can do it in a political way, in a gentle way. There's so many elements. Like you can get everything right. But when the customer goes to apply, it's a terrible application journey and people just give up. Yep. Like every other element is right. It just falls over there. But yeah, whose fault it is a fun game to play.
Yeah. And then he had one last follow-up then. He says, how do you sell your model? Like when you have a new one, how do you sell it to stakeholders internally?
So I have a little bit about that. I might come back to that one.
Sure.
Yeah, if that's okay.
And Des has one question as well. He said, what kind of external validation do you use? /might, I presume, I presume he means external, maybe to the model or whatever.
Okay, again, I have a bit about that.
Perfect.
So I might come back, but definitely to both Greg and Des, if I don't answer your question at that time, poke the questions through again.
Okay.
Okay, cool. All right. So, sorry, Mick, you're going to mute again, so until I see you again. Okay, so the typical path, and this is, right, if you're in a production environment, don't shout at me if this isn't your path. This is what I thought was it's fairly high level path to getting to a state where you're ready to go into production. So the first thing is, in general, you probably have a trial. So somebody gets the idea to build a model. Hopefully you have somebody around who can build a model. If not, you might outsource it if you can get the budget to do that. You build a model, you convince somebody it works, you convince somebody to test it for you by creating a campaign using this, and we get live data and we see, do customers actually buy it after we contact them with it? And then we measure, do they buy it or not? Okay, and if you're doing this kind of proof of concept approach, there's probably a good bit of measurement there, because otherwise you can't prove that it's working or not. Hopefully you manage to prove, if you can convince them to have a control set. So you divide your customers into treatment and control. The treatment, see the message, the control either don't get contacted, or even better would be contacted with some generic message. And you test it and you see if you can prove that those who saw the targeted message took out the product at a higher rate than those who just saw the generic message. So you do that. The second stage is evangelize. We got some evidence this worked. We tell everybody that will possibly listen. You go and you present to any diverse area you can get, and you make a big song and dance about it. Hey, we got a model and the model works. And hopefully you drum up some support. You back off mute.
Yeah. Yep. And just to ask then, one of the things I have heard in terms of resist, now I've never really, well, I've kind of encountered this myself, but not to the same extent that others seem to. The whole randomized control trial thing, that sounds awfully technical, and we might be losing sales. So how typically have you found that discussion to go?
Yeah, that's a fun one. Sometimes it's suggested, I've seen it suggested, that you use the customers who have opted out for contact. That's a terrible idea, right? They've already said they want to be contacted. You shouldn't use them as a control group. But I've seen that suggested as a nice way to not lose any customers.
Right.
Try not go with that way. Often,
just for the record, I think it's a completely bogus argument, because I think if you're not doing that, then you're not really doing anything. So, and how do you know you've lost customers if you're not measuring it? And the only way to measure it is to do this. So
to have control groups, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I've seen is a suggestion that you have a control group at the start, so you prove it's working, and then you reduce the percentage of customers going into the control group. That kind of sounds like a compromise, because you're still getting the maximum customers you can in while having some kind of control group. But that assumes that your model performance and your campaign performance is going to be uniform. It's not going to drop over time. So,
or even doesn't have a seasonality.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
unless, I mean, that's great if you're running it for a couple of years, because then you're capturing a few annual trends. But you're probably not. Let's face it; it's probably running over a couple of months.
Yeah, and that's it. Sometimes different campaigns, like if you don't have the capacity to run every campaign all the time, campaigns come in and out. Now, one thing we have done is look at the seasonality of product take-up for all the different products, and then we've gone back out and said, look, you need to be targeting people. People tend to take out, say, first-time buyer, and don't remember the details, so I'm making this up, but they take out first-time buyer for the summer months. So you want to be going out contacting people with a first-time mortgage propensity. You want to talk to them 2 months before we can see this peak in applications. So that's a good way of kind of using analytics to make sure that they're going out at the right time. But yeah, control groups, if you can, I think the only way to do it is do it from the beginning. And it's easier to protect it than it is to try and do it halfway through.
Yeah.
But if you can argue that we need to show it's working, because if it can't show it's working, we'll just quietly disappear into the background and we won't annoy you again. I think that's the better way. You know, the idea that you are going to measure it and show them hard numbers of how well it's working.
Right. Cool.
Okay. All right. Scale up. Okay. So this is the next stage. So you've built your trial. You've told everybody who will possibly listen about it. And you've drummed up some support for it. So now you start thinking, how can we do this faster? Your team you're still getting new data through the models. You're still scoring them manually, right? Because you haven't managed to get a production system yet. The scores are sitting in your dev environment, but you're in the point maybe where the business is coming to you asking for models. You haven't to go out. You've kind of gone past the stage where you've had to go out and say, hey, we think we can build a model for this new thing. You know, you're not anymore persuading people to listen to you. You've done that part. People are now coming to you and they've said, oh, we heard you built that model and it helped that campaign. Can you do the same for us? This is great, right? This is success. This is where we want to be. So then you create your production environment. You migrate all your models to this setup. Time consuming, probably. That's the bit that kind of gets swept under the carpet. You set up a whole new team to run this production environment. You set up all your governance, model validation, which is, I've got a little bit more on that. That was the question that Des had. And every process points to these new locations, all right? But this is what you wanted, right? We've proved it's worked so much so that somebody has given us money to put in a production environment. Happy days. The next stage, you're all up and running. I've made this sound quite easy. We'll get to that. It's not necessarily as straightforward as they sound, but your production environment's up and running. We've got a full production environment. We're grand. And the next stage then is other areas of the business come to you and say, hey, we know you did this process. Can you help us? And that's quite nice. That's a nice place to be. But I'm going to come back to this stage 4 bit that I had there, where you're creating your production environment for a bit, and just kind of highlight my experience of it.
You mean it doesn't just work by magic?
This is what you're sold, okay? You are told. Sorry, Mick, you there?
Yeah, I was saying it just doesn't work by magic with a couple of keystrokes or a git checkout.
Oh no, you're told it will. What you're sold is this wonderful thing that won't take too long. You put nice data in, okay, and your data is all going to be organized. There's a wonderful shiny factory and beautiful models come out the far side, right? That's what you're sold. What you get? You get disparate data sources. Somebody wants you to use some Excel data. It's coming from legacy systems. Nobody really thought about how to get all the data in one place at the same time. Maybe some of it's production, maybe some of it's not production data. Your production team are going to get very upset about the suggestion that you don't use production data. Then you've got a factory, but you don't have the luxury of building the factory and then creating the models. What you're going to find is the factory, you start building it, and then you're continuing to build it while you're also building models in the factory itself. Okay, so this idea that you haven't really got a roof, you're still trying to put the roof on while you're using this factory to build models. And then your models are coming out, and maybe you're getting a whole load of them out at once, and you're not sure what monitoring you're meant to be doing, right? Because I mentioned that's a bit of an afterthought sometimes. Maybe they're coming out in a different format than what you expected. Maybe you're not entirely sure how to interpret those results, how to get those results downstream. It's never as good as what you think you're going to get. It will eventually be, okay? So what you're going to get to this nice bit over on the left, you will eventually get there, but definitely nowhere near as quickly as the sales team of whatever platform you're going with have told you you're going to get there.
And actually, I mean, in my experience, it can't be. And that's not what I'm saying is that's not even a deficiency in management or process or organization. That's just the inherent nature of building the models, because it's almost a waste of effort to try and get everything all ready to go and then ready for quote unquote productionization, because the model inputs has to, like, the details of the implementation is very important to the actual building of the model. So it has to be this kind of feedback process whereby, you're building the roof as you're producing the outputs, because you don't actually know what roof you need. And you won't know what roof you need until you start figuring out where the water's hitting the floor.
There's definitely a lot of that in it. But I do think, look, sales teams are there to sell you stuff. They're not there to show you the warts and all approach.
No, that's true.
And I have had sales teams kind of say, oh yeah, but that's what we told you then. That's not the reality. They've really admitted it, which at least they're honest. But yeah, and again, this is to anyone who's gone down, if anyone's on the call who's gone down this production route soon, just bear it in mind. When you start to do this bit, you're probably not going to have the luxury of building everything and then just putting models through it. It's going to be a bit of building the factoring while you put models through it. It's a little frustrating. There's also a lot of fun stuff that you can do there in terms of determining how you want stuff to work and the governance around it and how you organize your team to build the models and how you evaluate all that good stuff. If you know that it's going to be a question that you're going to be dealing with and you can put the time to it, it's actually really, really fun and interesting to sort out. It's only when, you've got senior management who've signed all the checks for the process on the left, and they think they've got to shine your factory, and the factory's there. What do you mean it's taking time? That's the frustrating bit.
Yeah, I can well imagine.
Cool. Okay. All right. So what have I got next? Okay, so working as part of a production environment. So this is the kind of the bit I wanted to spend a bit of time on, and I've got a couple of slides after this now that'll answer some of the questions I promised I'd answer at the start. So if you were working in a production environment, you probably will want, and I can't think of any good reason you wouldn't want, your production team should be separate to your development team. There should be a clean division between them in terms of their tasks, their responsibilities, in terms of their environment access. Your dev team should not really have access to the production environment at all. Your production team may need access to the dev environment, may not. So that should be clearly kind of divided. Whether they both sit under the same kind of reporting line or in different areas, that's another thing. It probably depends on the setup that you have. So you need to decide who does what, where are they divided, where do they overlap? And that's another good thing. We can think quite well about where they divided, but there are going to be times there will be overlap. And where is that overlap and how do you decide then who does what? Does your dev team also look at data? Okay, and this is something that I'm probably not going to go into much after this, but I've heard a lot of good evidence and a lot of good reasonings for saying that, your dev team don't actually pull together the data, right? So in this setup, I'm on the development team. I say, okay, I want to build a model for a mortgage. I go off to the data team and I say, hey, I need data that will say whether somebody has a mortgage, what interest rate it has, when does it finish, blah, 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 blah. And they go and they source the data. And then I build a model. I think that possibly works well in maybe very, very strongly regulated areas. So I'm kind of thinking of in a financial institute of risk environment, there it makes sense that you've got a data team purely just to say, this is the assured best version of that piece of data that you need.
In my experience, that will only be, even in highly regulated areas, that will only be under very specific circumstances like regulatory reporting. And any data that isn't part of that regulatory reporting will not be well maintained, or certainly not to the same degree. Yeah, I mean, that the idea of having data and dev separate is probably not good. I could see that being problematic just for all sorts of reasons.
So that was my view of it. Now I'm coming from an area, right, we're regulated. I work in a bank, we are regulated. We're not the most regulated in the bank. There are other areas that are more regulated than us. And that was put to us initially when we were setting up. It was like, do you want to have a team that will only go and look at the data? Our view at the time was, no, we want the data scientist who is going to be building the model to be that close to the data, because otherwise you risk them getting a problem that they're going to solve by building a model, but without fully understanding the data behind it. Mm-hmm. So there's that reason as well. And luckily enough, where I've been working, we don't have to have this other data team. Now, there's times you'd like it. There's times when you are working with a product that you've never worked with before, and nobody really knows what the data is, and nobody knows what the fields mean. There's no data dictionary, and it's a bit of a pain, but it's not a bad trade-off.
Yeah, and how much overlap do you think there should be between dev and prod? Because I'm assuming you're going to have some.
That's coming up on my next slide.
Oh, perfect.
I'll get to that one then. Okay.
Cool.
Okay. So what else had I got here? I got who tests or validates the model, right? I'm going to talk about that in the next slide as well. Who reviews the monitoring? Who's responsible for issues when things go wrong in prod? Okay. So this is where I've all the questions I've said. I'll get to that in a bit. This is it. So where do your teams interact, right? And where's the overlap? So this is I've got a flow here, and this is my view of how it could work well and should work well. So you've got your dev team, right? This is the green boxes. They define the problems. They talk to the business stakeholders and say, oh, you want to build a model? What do you want it for? What are the products? What's in scope? What's out of scope? You're going to drive a lot of that conversation as a data scientist, but you're going to be the ones liaising with the actual product, the domain experts. You create that into a data set that you're going to use if that data is sitting with the dev team rather than a specific data team. So you basically translate from English into code. You get your training, your test data set, you build your model. So all of the feature reduction, any feature engineering, deciding on algorithms, tuning algorithms, all that kind of stuff, right? That you do that. You evaluate your model. So there was a question about kind of who evaluates the model. In my experience, in everything I've done, we evaluated ourselves initially, right? So this initial evaluation is saying, does it pass the thresholds that we have set for a good model? If we're building champion and challenger models, then we will use this evaluation to decide which one is champion and which one is challenger. And then in terms of evaluating the model, you can have metrics. The ones we tend to focus on tend to be things like your ROC and your lift, or maybe a precision recall curve instead of a ROC curve, your lift, the top features that are coming through, do they make business sense? And is there any evidence for self-prediction? Okay, so all that good stuff there. And then you present the model back to the business and you say, okay, this is what we think, and usually look for feedback from them. So you might go and say, this model predicts that people in a rural location are more likely to want this thing. And hopefully your business stakeholders are going to sit there and nod their head and go, yeah, that makes sense from what we think. But sometimes they will come and say, actually, that doesn't tie in with what we think, okay? And then maybe you have to do a little bit more analysis. Hopefully you're not back rebuilding the model, but it can happen. But hopefully you're just doing a bit of analysis to see why there's a bit of an anomaly there. And then, right, so you've got your sign off from your business say, yep, we're happy, and you get the model production ready, okay? So now hopefully, and again, this is kind of a maturity thing. I think initially when you build your model, you build it in a dev environment and then you make it production ready. After a while, you realize that's a really time-consuming way to do it. So you build it in a way that means it's almost production ready. So you don't have to make many changes. Most of the changes in terms of production ready are probably just about putting in environment variables. So it's pointing at a dev environment initially, and then as it gets promoted into a production environment, it just points at the relevant environment variables. Do you have something, Mick?
Yeah, just going back on terms of it's a thing in Crowdcast, that final box in the bottom left is kind of blanked by all our faces. So I presume it's saying it's presented to the stakeholders.
Yeah, sorry.
What do you do? Like, how often in your experience are the stakeholders wrong? That, like, you've actually done the right thing, you've got a model that's doing what it says it is, and it's actually giving a counterintuitive result. Because I have seen that happen. Now, most of the time, I would totally agree that I would agree with the stakeholders. 95% of the time they're right. But every so often, it does throw stuff up because you're presenting things, especially when people are very close to a business. You might be showing things to them in a way that they've never really thought about it or seen it before. So it gives them a view to the business that's like counterintuitive, that, and their instinct is to say that's wrong. And how often have you came across that? Have you ever gone where actually the model is, for some definition of right, and you've had pushback from like the business owners or whatever, and they've been wrong and the model has actually been right, as opposed to due to a bug?
Not often, but
okay.
I think a lot of it depends on this. I don't know if I can point at the screen, but that very top box defines the problem with the business stakeholders. I think what I have learned over time is to put a lot of your effort into that. And that's a massive part of the time we would spend building a model, is that first bit. So we analyze every single thing about it. For example, if it's a loan model, then what about top-ups? Can you identify them? Are they in scope? Are they out scope? The business might want them in scope, But in terms of a customer behavior, somebody taking their first loan looks very different to somebody taking the top up. So maybe you don't want to. So I think spending a lot of time defining that problem initially is well worth it. We would also get the business to sign off, to formally email and agree this is the problem we want the model for. And that really helps focus their attention on what it is that they're looking for. Because they're great sometimes at just agreeing along. And then you say, sign off on it. And they go, oh, well, hang on now. What about that bit over there? Maybe that's in scope, that's out of scope. So I think that can help get rid of a lot of it.
Okay.
I can think of 2 models that we built where there was that kind of issue. So one of them, it was something agriculture, remember? I think it was for an agricultural loan. And they came back to us in the end and they said, oh no, we think those kind of customers, which are farmers, are more likely to be in this part of the country than where you're seeing them, because we'd mapped it out by geography. It turned out there was something in the way the farmers were being defined, they might have been in terms of their income or something, that those kind of farmers were more likely. So we were right, but that only came about from doing a bit of analysis. So we presented one thing, they said that's not what we expect. We chatted a bit, we went off and did some analysis, we chatted some more, and we were able to reconcile it. That doesn't happen often, but yeah, it is. And it's good to be looking for that kind of feedback. You know, it's not great that they disagree with it, but it's good that they're that involved, that they're like, hang on a second, you know, I don't know if that's right. But by the time you go through all that with them, then hopefully they're really confident in the model.
Getcha.
Yeah,
cool.
And I've had one model where after 6-8 weeks of building it, we presented it back to them and they said, thank you very much. And as we were walking out the door, they said, oh, we just want to make this one change. Can we tweak the model? I said, no, that's an entire rebuild. That's not happening. Trying to keep your composure after 8 weeks of work is just down the tube.
I just want to make this small little change.
Man, tweaks. I hate the word tweaks. There's no tweaks in a bloody model. It's a whole model build. Oh man. Okay, so that's your dev team. Okay. Model validation. Now I've put this here and there's an external and a question mark here. This really depends on probably how regulated your industry is, how regulated your area of the industry is. Do you need any model validation? I do some, to be honest, but you've already evaluated your model. Okay, that's part of what you've done. So this model validation is we've evaluated the model, we're happy with it. It's gone back to the business, they're happy with it. Okay, so this is kind of a final validation. If it's been done externally, it probably depends on how big an impact of a model it is. So in terms of the ones we do, which say, should we contact this person about a loan or not? You know, should we tell them how that Bank of Ireland do loans? Like that's the level. We're not making decisions about who gets loans. Versus, say, the probability of default models, which are the ones that are going to be used to say whether or not you get a loan or not. Obviously, our models shouldn't need the same validation as those probability of default ones. It would be a waste of time to spend that much effort validating our models. Also, those probability default ones, they take, I don't know, a year-ish to build. Ours are a lot quicker, 6 to 8 weeks. So you wouldn't want to be having the same level of validation. So whether or not it needs an external validation, and if yes, who does it? Is it a whole validation team? Is it enough that it's what we call a desktop review, which is that I'll take you through the model. You can definitely question stuff, but you're not going off doing a whole rake of extra tests. And who does that then? If it's that desktop review, is it an external team? Is it just somebody else on the data science team, but who is separate to the model build? So there's some independence there. That really depends on your level of regulation that you require. Did you have something, Mick?
Yeah, and just to say that I don't know if you were at it, Fiona, but one of the last Dublin data science talks before the lockdown, I think it was towards the end of 2019 or maybe early 2020, we had a speaker who did that stuff for the mortgages and why basically Irish mortgages are so expensive. And it was he talked a lot about all the validation that goes into their credit default modeling. And yeah, it's an entire process. And exactly to go to your point about regulated, it was unbelievable. It sounds hellish. It sounds like it's so heavily regulated. All you're effectively doing is pulling the crank on a handle on a machine and just letting the whole thing churn, because you can't actually change anything because it's a regulated model that has been set in stone and nothing can change. Yes, I've got someone here saying it's hell. It's just not a lot of fun. But like just the level of controls that were in place, yeah, I mean, it's just incredible.
So we're lucky we're not subject to the same level. But
Yeah.
what happens is those models tend to get validated, that's part of their process. And then somebody notices us and says, well, they've got models, they need validation. And then they come to us with the same expectations. And we spend most of our time going, hang on a second, do we need that level of validation? And that tends to be how the conversation goes for the first week or two. You're like, hang on a second, we don't need that level of validation. And eventually you get it through to them that, and they usually agree, but they're so in the environment where the validation is a massive, intense vehicle. And then suddenly we're sitting there going, we don't need that. We don't need that level of validation.
You avoid that like the plague for as long as you possibly can.
Yes. And trying to set the right tone for the first model you get validated is so important, because whatever happens the first one's going to happen for the rest. It's a big part of it. Okay, so you've got your model validated. You've got your model validated, and then we've ready for production. We hand it over to our production team. This is the guys in blue. So they probably do some basic tests on their side to ensure the model is production ready. They probably have some kind of pre-production environment that they can promote it to do some more tests to make sure that nothing is going to break any other model or any other data in there. And that's particularly important if there's interdependencies between models. So if you have one model that only scores after this other model scores, then you definitely need to do those kind of tests in pre-prod. Then you promote to a production environment, and it schedules it to run at whatever required frequency and schedules all the dependencies and data. And then usually they're responsible for the read and write access from the production tables, okay, because they're the production guys. Okay, so happy days. You've got your model, is finished. It's completely in production. We've got a production environment. Everyone is delighted until the first problem occurs. And then, and this again is a very organic process, what I found, this is the bit nobody's thought about this. Everyone just has an assumption that somebody will fix it. And then who fixes it? Is it the dev team? Is it the prod team? It's probably not always just one team, but trying to figure that out and trying to define who does what, not always straightforward. Nick?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say about this is, the one thing I know for certain in this is not my problem. It's not my fault. It's definitely someone else's. I mean, that's the only thing I can state about this with 100% certainty.
If only that worked. That does not work. That is not a good answer.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's definitely not going to be me.
Oh,
yeah, I can just imagine. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, we never thought about that one.
And the thing is, once you say it, it's usually a thought, like somebody goes, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But by this stage, you're probably well away from that point where somebody has signed the check to get all of this set up. And their attention's gone. They're kind of like, oh, it's your problem, you fix it. And sometimes it makes sense that this particular problem, dev team fix, that particular problem, production team fix. But trying to get that agreement sometimes it works really smoothly, sometimes a little bit less smoothly. And I've heard problems where it's just like an ongoing row. Luckily not worked in that kind of environment, but that's not great at all.
No. Oh, this goes back to my point about the overlap, actually, because it's things like that why the overlap is, you probably need a couple of people who have their foot in both camps, because they're essentially the communication layer between the two.
There's a bit of that. So I've got a flow here let's see, I'll take you through this and see what you think then, okay?
Sure.
Okay, so this is following on. So this is, okay, we've realized we've got a problem, who's going to fix it, right? So this is my ideal way of doing it, rather than a description of what actually happens. So ideally you get some monitoring set up. Okay, so we talked at the start about the monitoring. Ideally you get your monitoring scheduled. So you're going to be monitoring the volume that are scored every month. Make sure that's not changing wildly. You're going to monitor your input features. Check the distribution there, pop something like population stability index, make sure that's not changing wildly. Check your output scores, make sure they're not changing wildly, and hopefully everything goes okay. So ideally, some kind of regular monitoring that's done on a scheduled basis. If it's all good, happy days, we let it run, and then we try again the next month if it's a monthly model. If there's a problem, okay, so we investigate the issues in prod. Now, these are all in purple. Who does what? You investigate the issues in prod. If there's no issues, if you've looked and you said, actually, it turns out that's fine, that's seasonality, or it's not as big a change as we thought, or it's something that can be fixed, okay, maybe it's an issue that can be fixed. So maybe the issue that caused the score distribution to look very different is the fact that a field is corrupted in our data set, in the data set that gets pulled in. So nothing to do with the data science team, right? This is production data in EDW, therefore it is production EDW's problem. they fix it. Okay, and then happy days, we're all back. Now, in terms of who does what, a lot of times I think the initial analysis is usually going to be with the production team, just to ascertain, is it a problem with production? If it's a problem with downstream data, so if it's a problem with data that you pull into the model, but it's not something the data science team have feature engineered. It is a production EDW field that you pull into your model. Okay, so somebody else is standing over the quality of the production EDW. Then, okay, in fairness, that can be your production team to go back and say, hey, we've noticed this problem. What's going on? What can happen, and this is the painful bit sometimes, is that it's a field that you're bringing into your model and somebody's changed, right? So we had this example in one particular model. The field initially was a yes, no. Somebody changed it in production to, not on our side, so this is a data thing, and they changed it to now be a count. So what was a binary 0, 1 was now a count of 1 plus. And this happened the very first model, a month after the model went live. The entire model fell over, couldn't use it, had to be rebuilt. So it was months of work wasted there. But in terms of identifying the field, that doesn't require the development team. But again, often it comes down to resources. So sometimes it's a case that your production team will do a kind of a quick pass initially. Ideally, and if anyone is in the middle of setting up a production environment or going to be setting one up, this is the biggest bit of advice I can give you, is try and have a process at the start. Try and get this bit in early. Who does what? Is it the case that, it's in production, therefore it is the production team's responsibility, so they have to go and check the data source? But then you don't want to leave it all with the production team, because at some point you're going to find that the issue is something related to the model. So it's a field that, as like that example that was binary, is now a level field, a number of levels. Somebody needs to go and say, well, actually, we can't use that field anymore. We need to find a new field. We need to repoint to this new field, but somebody's got to test it and check that that's valid. That stuff probably sits with your data science team, right? They're the ones who built it. They've the data science, the skills, the modeling skills. They're closest to it. They're the ones that have spent weeks talking to the business, going through data, figuring out different fields, figuring out the meaning of all the fields. So at some point, it's probably going to come back to them. So the bit I had at the end of this here was, what if it can't be fixed? Who does what? If it's a repoint, and I've got these definitions now in the next slide, because these are something else that could mean anything. But if it's a repoint, as in we're just changing where we point to for a particular field, that can be your production team. If it's a retrain, and we've set up the model that you can just click go and retrain it, and again, I'll say exactly what I mean by retrain on the next slide, that's probably within your production team. But if it's a rebuild, okay, sorry, so there's your repoint. There's your retrain. You're coming back to the point where you're building the model again and evaluating it. That can sit with your production team to do the retrain, but you probably want your data science, your development team to actually do the evaluation. They did it last time when they were building it. They're closest to it. And then worst case scenario, you've tried your repoint, you've tried your retrain. It's just not going to work, and it's a full rebuild, and that's back to the beginning. Mick?
Yeah, there were 2 points I was thinking there. That the first one is just on that whole thing on the right-hand side. I mean, it just shows you why company culture is just so important, because that can very easily turn into a blame storm where no one wants to take responsibility for anything, and not even necessarily in a bad way, because if you don't try and avoid taking responsibility, you become the sucker at the table. And I've seen that happen, like, no matter how, you don't even have to be like, just being a dick. It's just that if I'm the idiot here and everyone else is, this is the way things work, I'll end up with doing everyone else's job. And that, but also, I mean, first of all, that 0 to 1 and then it becomes a count. That sounds like an absolute bastard of a problem, because that would be hard to spot. I'm just assuming that it was a 0, 1 as opposed to a true false. Yeah. So if you have a 0 and a 1 and suddenly it's holding a 2, that's going to take ages to spot.
It did. It really did. And then
that was like, oh my god.
Oh man, it was production data.
I really feel your pain there.
That shouldn't be happening. But yeah, the poor guy who spent ages building that, and it ran once and fell over, and then had to be rebuilt.
Oh no.
When data science goes wrong. But yeah, like, I'm lucky I've never worked in a place where those bits in purple were really contentious, and but it is something, the earlier in setting up your production environment, you can decide, you can at least acknowledge that there is going to have to be discussion here, the better, I think.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you really do run the risk.
And you do kind of need both teams involved for all the reasons you illustrate, because it's totally, I mean, I get it, it's a prod production, like it's a prod problem initially, but at some point it's unreasonable to expect everyone in prod to like that 0, 1 to 2 thing. That's a great example of it. I mean, okay, theoretically you could notice that the data type has changed, but like I said, it probably hasn't. It was probably an int. It wasn't a logical field. It was an int field that just happened to only have 0 or 1 in it. And now all of a sudden it's a 2. So from a cursory inspection, you don't notice a change. And the only way you're going to get that is having the dev people involved, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, in terms of responsibility, it couldn't all sit with the production team. At some point, the issue is going to be much closer to the people who built it than those are just productionizing. But now there are some ones that sit clearly with prod. So this repoint, so here, I'm going to move on and explain what I mean by repoint, and then I'll explain why I think that sits mainly with production. So for a repoint, okay, in my terminology, a repoint is where you're replacing a data source in a production model. Okay, so we've got age as an example. That originally came from the demographics table, but for some reason we're not using that anymore. It's not reliable for what we need, so we're now going to take it from customer details table instead. All right, made up table names. That is just going into the production code and changing a table name. Now, your dev team should not be able to do that. There should be governance around it, so nobody from dev should be able to just go in and change that. So who's going to do it? Okay, my scenario would be your development team test the new data source. So we find the new data source, we test it, we potentially run a dev version of the model. So same model, just repointing to this new source, and we just check that it all works fine. Then we say to the production team, yeah, this works. Here's our evidence. We've tested it. We submit a change request form. We say, please update this code in production. Okay, so that's the two teams working together. Very different, like there is a very defined difference with roles there, but we're going to have to work together. The other one too I had there, one of them was retrain. Now this I have heard many, many discussions about what exactly is a retrain of a model. And there's many different terms as well. Okay, it's sometimes known as refresh. My definition, and I'm sure people will have differences, is that the same features are available, same algorithm is available. You're just training it on new data. So in terms of the same features, you are not letting it select new features, right? So if you have 500 features available, you're not letting it select new features. If there was 20 in the original model, it can select up to 20 now. It may decide that one of those features is no longer needed. Okay, so that might be such a low importance in the model that's not worth including. That's okay, right? But you're not bringing in any new features. It's the same algorithm. Ideally, it's the same parameters and everything, right? So it's the same model essentially. It's just fresh data going through it. In terms of who does that, either one could run the retrain. If you have the environment that's sold to you, you'll probably have your salespeople saying that it's a click of a button to get a retrain. It is never a click of a button to get a retrain. But your developer team can do an awful lot to leave the models in such a state that you can do a retrain really easily. And it's not quite press a button, but it's not far off it. But then, so that's a lot of work in the developers when they're initially creating the model. The production team are potentially the ones to run it. But then you probably need the developers to check that the performance is suitable. And one thing that I like the idea of this is running your retrain model as a challenger model. Okay, so you've got your original model, remains the champion. So the champion is the one that feeds any downstream users. So any kind of contact, customer contact or insights is done off your champion model. But you retrain it as a challenger and you run the two of them in parallel for a number of months maybe. And you check the performance and make sure that your challenger is better. Now, that assumes that your champion is underperforming a little bit, but still suitable to use. If it's fallen over, you're probably not going to go with this approach. Mick, did you want something?
Yeah, just to on the retrain, and just for the record, I actually like those definitions. The thing about the retrain, just so I'm clear, you said like, let's say you had 500 input features, and then on the new one, it can't bring any new. Does that mean you don't expand the 500? Or does it mean if you were only using 20 features, you can't actually go beyond those 20 features?
Okay, so if you're sitting down to build a model initially and you have 500 features available, hopefully all 500 haven't gone into your model because chances are, it doesn't need all 500. Sometimes I've seen that done because people think, what's the harm? But any one of those 500 falls over, and now your whole model's gone. And it could be a field that's not actually used in the model. Like it's model importance number 499, but it's still in there and it can still break it. So ideally, if you've got, say, 500 features available, you've picked maybe the top 20 or 40 or something, and that's in your model. So then when you go to retrain it, it can use that subset of 20. So it can pick any of those 20. It can change the importance of them, but it can't bring in a new feature. If it's bringing in a new feature, in my definition, that's a rebuild rather than a retrain.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
Well,
and then
the one reason I'm thinking of is because if you're doing something like a lasso, then with new data, some of those features may be driven to 0. So, but I guess that's changing the importance. So yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And changing the importance, I don't think is surprising for a retrain, because your original model is underperforming enough that you want to retrain it. So it's not surprising it's going to find a slightly different feature importance.
Well, you kind of want it to, because otherwise it's not really retraining.
It's not working. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So that's your retrain. And then the last one I have is rebuild. So here you're pretty much back to the drawing board. Now, maybe you might be lucky enough that you don't have to redefine your target or your population criteria, so you don't have to go back to the business, but you want to try different features. Okay. And probably if you're getting to rebuild, you've probably tried a retrain, because that's the easy win, but maybe that's just not working. So something has changed drastically. Either the behavior has changed, right? So you need your data is just not suitable anymore, or even worse than is that your target needs to be redefined, or your kind of your population criteria, how you define who's eligible for scoring for the model, needs to be changed. That then is back to a whole new. That's essentially a new model rebuild with all the time and testing that you need there. Okay, so I think I've 2 more slides on this. So this one is kind of related to all of that. So it's kind of about how is your dev and your prod team organized. So does your production team look at just one kind of model? As in, is it just the marketing models that I build? Or are they looking at, is it just one production team for everything? Do you have the risk models and the marketing models and HR models and audit models and everybody in together? Yes, can work sometimes in terms of skills. You know, you've got your right skill set, but what happens if I've got models coming in every 6 to 8 weeks because we build them quickly? Risk model then takes a year. And then is the risk model more important? If it suddenly comes in and it's going to take months to productionize, do all of my models just sit there because they're not as important as a risk model and not go anywhere? There's definitely advantages and disadvantages to having your production team, having one production team to do all productionization versus a production team for each kind of area. But that's one thing to consider. How do you communicate between the teams? And I'm thinking now in terms of making changes. So that idea I had where you want to repoint something. Is it just I email going, hey, production guy, please change this? Easy, but probably not the best thing. So it really shouldn't be that simple to change something in production. It probably should be a kind of a more formal change request process where I say, hey, this is the change we want. Here's the change request form. Here's the evidence that we have tested it. Somebody on our side has signed off to say this is good to go. That's probably the process you want. It shouldn't be that easy to change stuff in production. It's a balance. You don't want it to be in the point where to make a small change in production is a massive big process, and changes can't be made. And therefore, if a model stops scoring because it's kind of fallen over because one of the data inputs has changed, and you know what the fix is, and it's a small fix, but you can't get it through because the process is so cumbersome, that's not great. That's kind of you're halting all your work for that. And that's what my next point is about, is you don't want the productionization to hold up the delivery of models to your users, because that's when they become valuable. We can sit and build a model for 2 or 3 months. That's not the value. The value is when we actually deliver it and somebody can use it. And I've kind of called out, there's loads of reasons why this can become an issue, but I've kind of called out from 2 different aspects. So one of them is that you've made your production process just too complex, right? It just takes too long to get models into production. It's a massive blocker. And then what happens is you end up having a production process, but you're running your models in dev and your developers are running them manually to get the scores to give them to the team that are going to do the context. And you're back where you were before you started any of this. And it's no good having a production environment. And that's a frustrating place to be, because somebody has spent a lot of money, your team has spent a lot of time getting all these models into production, and now the production is just too cumbersome. And the other one I had is that we're not considering the time it takes to productionize. Okay, and as a data scientist, I have done this in the past, and I apologize to my production people, but you kind of forget. You say, right, I will finish the model on Friday the 15th. The model will be available on Friday the 15th, and I forget that production takes time, and the production guys are not going to have the model productionized in like less than a day. So that's the other way it can come in. Nick?
Yeah, I was just saying that in terms of bypassing prod. I mean, it's the same in security. You can't have it so complex because people will work around it. And exactly, I mean, that's exactly what will happen. People will end up throwing their production, throwing the new predictions into a bloody CSV file and sending it via an email attachment, to the relevant media team, and they'll just figure out a way informally around the process. That happens all the time.
I'm sitting here trying not to look guilty. Yeah, it does happen all the time. And all your wonderful governance that you set up is gone, and somebody gets upset.
Yeah, well, I mean, because it's bad governance, right?
Yeah,
because
you should not be doing that.
It's incentivizing people to bypass the system,
and it's a waste. You've got this wonderful shiny factory that you've spent a lot of time building.
Yeah,
and but I think that's something you hit to some degree or another, because there's just going to be a mismatch of expectations, and it just has to be sorted out. So hopefully it doesn't become a problem for long, and you manage to solve it. So there are the two decisions I had there, are kind of related to there. It's how easy is it to change your code when it's in production, and that's that balance of you want to be able to do it quickly enough, but you don't want to be able to do it so easily that anyone can just email somebody in production, go, hey, make this change, and there's no evidence of that it's been signed off. And then attached to that is another bit, like, what are the implications of changing code in a model that's already in production, right? So I create my model, I get it ready for production, it's all been signed off, I hand it over to the production team, put it in production, I realize there's a problem. There's something I want to change in it, or there's something that business requests for change, or data change or something. What happens, like, how do we deal with that? If it's already in production, but it only went into production yesterday and I need to change, I'm probably going to piss off my production people, but that's not a big deal. What if it's already scoring? Scores are going through this model, it's been written out somewhere. What if those scores are being used by somebody? Right? What if the scores are being used, customers have been contacted, and I come along and I say, hey, I want to change that. Can you just backfill the scores there for the last 3 months? Because there's a problem with the downstream data. Now, it's valid to some degree for me to say that, right? So say one of the fields that's coming into my model has been slightly corrupted, okay? So not so badly corrupted the model's fallen over. It's passed all our monitoring because we're good and we've got our monitoring up and running, but I realize there's a problem. So those scores, as a data scientist, those scores weren't valid because the data was wrong, but somebody's used them, right? Because we have been giving them to our contact team. They've been going out making phone calls. That data has been used. It doesn't sit well that we should just be able to overwrite that data. But at the same time, if somebody is using historic scores for some reason, so some other team is doing insights and they want to see how scores have changed over the last 12 months, you don't want them using the wrong scores either. That's a tricky area. The backfilling of scores, if it's the case where you are confident they've not been used for anything, it makes more sense to backfill them. But if you're not sure, or you know they have been used for something, you really, really shouldn't be backfilling them. And then you end up in that place where you've kind of got a copy. You've maybe got the bad copy, which is the scores that were using the incorrect data. You want to keep them for audit purposes because you know if they've been used to customer contact, but you don't want to make them available to people anymore. So you put them in another file and you put it away and nobody can access it unless they need it for audit. But that's something that people often don't think about until it comes up as a problem. And it can be a tricky one. Nick, do you have something?
I was just going to say, I mean, it may have been invalid data at the start, but it's sure as shit valid now.
That's it. You've used it. You've made it available.
Exactly. Yeah. And someone's putting in the classic _old version 2 final. It's if you ever look at, there's some very funny cartoons about how to use version control. And I'm seeing, and this is what I'm saying. I mean, you have an awful lot of problems. You have an awful lot of problems in the data world now that were quite analogous to the code world. And I haven't figured out, I mean, maybe they are out there, but no one has quite figured out data versioning yet, and it's something that's hitting me all the time now because, you get new data sources in, or the data structure changes, or you get new fields all of a sudden because you've upgraded your data subscription. So now you've got extra fields and they're being backfilled. Also, things change, the time evolution of data as well. Well, what did this data look like 2 years ago? versus what did it look like today? And did we know actually this? So another great one is, especially with financial data, is revisions. So, as of 2 years ago, we thought this number was this value, but then a year later, we changed the number from a year ago because things improved or whatever. Like, that's common with economic forecasting, like, with a lot of things, and they just go back and backfill stuff.
Yeah, we thankfully don't run into those kind of ones too much. But I guess one thing we do find is it depends on where you are in the organization. But I feel that risk areas in the banks that I've worked in, they get consulted when this data change is coming. We don't. We're a last minute after the change has been made. You might get told about it. Or generally the change is made, you shout because it's messed up all your models. And then you kind of say very pointedly, well, next time there's a change, can you tell us? And then you start getting included in the conversation. But I guess it's one thing when I would have started in all of this, and I came from a background where you were just building development models and you just use whatever data is necessary and that you're confident in. And then when you've got a production system and you try and use a dev table when you hand it over to your production team and they kind of go, well, no, we're not productionizing that.
Yeah.
This is why. Because they don't want this headache down the line because it's a development table. It's valid. And I can agree with them having been in it a while, but I remember the frustration at first. You've built a model. The model's great. And the only data available is that dev table. So you've used it. And then your production team is not happy. But this is why. Okay, so this is the final thoughts. Final thoughts. So you're convinced, right? You've listened to me for a little over an hour now. And you're like, right, she knows what she's talking about. This is what I need. I need this production environment. What do you do next? Okay, so I've covered a lot of stuff already. This is just a few last kind of thoughts here. So if you've gone through that kind of organic process I talked about, you've got a load of models already, right? Because that's where you got to your production environment or production decision by having models that work and proving they work, and people want models. So now you've got to migrate them, okay, into your production environment. This is another one. When I said about the factory, and the salespeople will tell you your factory will all work wonderfully, they will tell you can migrate your models seamlessly, and I wouldn't believe them. There may be a couple of options. So maybe there's some kind of a common language like PMML, or there's some wrapper you can put around it. It depends if you're changing language. Like if you built all your models in OR and you've got a production system in OR, maybe it's not as big a deal. But then if there can be version issues as well. How many models do you have? If you only have 3 models, and you only need to migrate 3, not a big deal. If you have 40 models, you need to migrate 40, maybe a bigger deal. And then the thing you really don't think about till you start migrating them, when you go to migrate the first few models you built and you look at them and you go, oh, we changed it. We don't use that process anymore. We no longer use that data because we realized there's a better way. We made sure that we also include this filter because it's more reliable, but we don't have that in the early ones, and you want to rebuild them. And this is the problem of having your development team do the migration. If you had a completely separate team come in and do it, they'd probably just migrate it. But when it's your developers who actually worked on the original models, they will want to make the changes. And you'll want to make them. And it's really hard to just say, no, I'm going to migrate like for like. You kind of have to, because chances are you've got too many models. It's going to take a long time. But that's a really hard thing to just walk away and say, no, I know it's not wrong, but it's not the way I'd like to have done it, knowing everything I know now, but I'm just going to migrate like for like. There's also probably going to be a dip in productivity in new model development. So everybody buys in, literally puts money into this production environment because it's going to speed up how quickly we can build models. But we've got to migrate all the old ones, and we've got to put all their governance, and we've got to build the factory. There's going to be a dip in productivity. And I think that dip probably goes on for longer than people think initially, or longer than anyone would want. It's going to happen. It can be a little bit soul destroying for a while as well, because you did all this to be able to build new models, and you started the year with 20 models, and all you did was migrate them, and you still just got 20 models. So there's just that dip there that you have to manage. In terms of setting up your production team, what skill sets do you need? For your production team, do you need more skills more towards the data engineer side? For your development team, do you want skills more towards the data science side? Do you need architects to help design it? What stack are you going with? Are you staying with the language that you already have used? And that's assuming you had one language. Maybe you have models developed in whatever language your developer wanted. Maybe you've got models in 3 kind of languages sitting there. If you're going with a different stack, are you going to have to train up your team on that new language? If yes, is that a big deal? Okay, maybe your developers will grumble. They all like using OR, and now they're told to use Python and nobody's happy. Like that's hopefully a temporary glitch until people get used to using it. What if you do a POC, right? Proof of concept, which is a great idea to do if you're kind of considering this route. particularly if you're not sure what you're going to go with. So you've got kind of SAS on one side, and maybe you've got Python on the other, and you kind of say, right, let's go with both of them in for proof of concept. We'll run both and we'll see which works better. You're probably going to try and develop a new model on it, and that makes sense, right? As a proof of concept, that's a good idea. But what gets totally left out is the migration. Okay, and again, as I said, if you've got 3 models to migrate, not a big deal. If you've got 40 models to migrate, you're going to be spending the next while not building new models, but migrating them. So doing a proof of concept on how you're going to migrate one of your models is probably not a bad idea if you can get them to agree to it. And the last point, and this kind of came up at the start as well, you've got funding for your factory development, but what about the ongoing maintenance? So I said that idea about trying to put new features into a customer analytic record. Nobody left money for that. Same thing for your factory. Like once it's up and running, if you want to put in the monitoring that wasn't done initially because nobody thought about it, and now setting up automated monitoring is not necessarily a simple task. Okay, there can be quite a bit to it, because you want to get to the point where your monitoring runs, you get an email alert if there's a problem, otherwise you do nothing, right? You don't have to log in, you don't have to plot anything, you don't have to check anything, you just get an alert if there's a problem. But getting that all automated is not necessarily straightforward. Who's going to pay for it? And that's often something that doesn't get talked about or considered until the very end, when the people who are the ones signing the checks have moved off this. They're onto something else now, and you're shouting about funding. It's not straightforward. So look, I think there might be a couple of questions we didn't come to. Any questions I said I would get to the end, I think I've answered them. So if I have not, please drop us a chat message and let us know. You still there, Mick?
I am. Hold on,
Okay.
I just got... Yeah, thank you for that. That was great. That was pretty much exactly what I have to say, actually, just that point at the very end, one thing that's just occurred to me, and I've gotten a lot less accommodating of it as I've gotten older. Like 5 or 10 years ago, I'd have been much more accommodating of a change of language. But now I think if someone honestly told me I wasn't using R anymore, I think my argument would be basically, you're hiring me for my expertise, and my expertise involves doing it in R, and I just cannot be effective in Python anymore. Like, or at least I can be, but I would be so far off the charts that there's no, I probably, like, that would be something I would fight quite difficult. Now, admittedly, I'm not in production, so that's different. I'm not, but in a production dev, absolutely. Like, I totally understand that. But I know if I was doing my work and someone told me I couldn't use R, I probably would be, well, maybe I'm not working here. Simply because I'm not productive anymore. Like,
there's definitely a bit of that. And it's something I think whoever is making the decision on what stack you go with is probably senior enough that that's not a big consideration for them.
Oh,
they're
absolutely.
Pretty much like code in or SAS, Python, whatever.
I think for that kind of dev, you kind of have to give people the options to use multiple ones. Like,
that's tough though when you're productionizing. Yeah.
Oh no, not for production. I don't. No. Production is different. That's a very different thing. But I mean, for the research and development work, which is generally what I'm doing. Oh no, in production you're crazy if you're using multiple languages.
You couldn't.
Like it just doesn't work. Now you can kind of have a modular thing where you have different pieces in different languages, and I've seen that work quite effectively. But even then, I wouldn't be using Python, or I'd be using like Node.js or something like that. Or I'm not really worked in a corporate environment, so I'm not sure how effective SAS is. I know it's been pretty effectively used in the various banks. Was it all in SAS in the banks?
Some, yes.
Yeah. I know SAS is used in a lot of the financial services, in various departments, and I think that seems to be quite effective. But yeah, I know I'd be the difficult one there. That would be me. I'm gonna, like, 5 years ago would have been way more accommodating, and I would have gone, yeah. But I've just noticed as I've gotten older and more cranky, and I'm like, I know how I do this, and you're hiring me for this, and this is how I'm going to do it. And then, if that doesn't work, that's fine. I won't be offended by it. I think
that's hard though. Places often run training as part of this whole productionization setup, but you're getting the training when you're so new to the language that you don't really know the questions to ask.
Exactly,
and then what you really need is the training 8 months down the line when you've tried a few things and you've had the frustration. And I know how to do this in R. How the hell do I do it in Python? You've had that.
And that's why I've found, and I've tried to use Python, and I've tried to use Julia. And just for the work I do, I can't. And I would totally, but as a result, I would be totally understanding of someone who comes at that from a Python point of view, where they just don't want to use R, because they're different enough to be really annoying when you try to use them. especially unless you're kind of using both in tandem. And even then, they're different enough that you're probably going to be really good in one and decent in another. And that's just kind of the way. But that's the language wars, which I don't really. There's no point in getting into. One thing I would, Paddy pointed out a question there, and he has a couple of questions which we'll get to in a sec because I am conscious of the time. Would a racing matrix help with the whole dev production data provisioning thing? You've heard of a racing? I know all about this stuff because my wife is a project manager, so I keep hearing the swear words coming from this bedroom because this is our office. Would that help at all?
I don't know. I've never used it for the data provisioning.
Right.
Again, the kind of models we build, we have a fairly short model build time, so we're not spending months and months and months at any one model. To be honest, if the data isn't fairly readily available, we're not using it. Just the timelines that we have for building. Yeah. So for others, maybe. For a lot of what I've done, just given that we're trying to keep it to a fairly quick turnaround on models, it's probably more work than it's worth.
Okay. And I'll ask the second question. Paddy asked a couple of questions here. He said, the models you're using, are they typically black box or explainable, or does it matter?
Yeah, fair question.
And again, the trade-offs.
Yeah, and again, because we're in a bank, that kind of comes up quite a bit.
Right.
To be honest, I've never been challenged on the idea of using something like a neural net that is fairly black box, but I've also not had to use them. So for the kind of data sets we're using, our data tends to be very highly skewed. So of your whatever population you've got, you might have 1% are targets. So it's incredibly heavily skewed. So what we found is tree-based models work quite well. Gradient boost and random forest work really well. I did a kind of a big test a couple of years ago, took one data set, one of these highly skewed data sets, and ran through a number of algorithms. Okay, so there was random forest, gradient boost, SVMs using a couple of different kernels, and neural nets. And the SVMs and the neural nets for those data sets didn't come close at all. So the tree-based ones. So we've not really come against that. Nobody has said for what we're doing, you can't use it.
Yeah.
There's some level of explainability needed for this business stakeholders when you go back and you present back the model.
Yeah.
But they're not looking at model metrics. Like if we show them rocked and lift and charts, they wouldn't care.
Yeah.
Like we'd lose them. We tend to show them what are the top variables, and that's the stuff that makes sense to them. So if we were to go back with a kind of a neural net model, if we could get some kind of proxy for variable importance, right, which is not necessarily straightforward, that would probably cover that. If somebody came to me in my team and said, I want to use a neural network in the model, I'd probably say no, because there's every chance that in a couple of months, somebody will look and say, oh, you're using neural nets. We probably shouldn't be using them. And then you've got to rebuild the model. So there's no formal ban.
It's a bit unfair as well, because as far as I'm concerned, a random forest isn't that bloody explainable either. I mean, theoretically it is, but then again, so is a neural network. It's explainable in the sense that you can look at the numbers, but I mean, a random forest isn't that like this, especially if you've got like 2,000 of them. So you've 2,000 different trees, and and boosting as well. I mean, they're theoretically explainable, but I don't think they're practically explainable. So I mean,
and that's probably what we do. We have decided that like who we're trying to explain it to is our business stakeholders. So we make sure we can explain it to them. But like we're not hiding anything about what we're doing. But so what we tend to do, and we look and we see of all the top features used, how is there a linear relationship between, say, high propensity score and low propensity score and that feature? Okay, and you plot it out and you show that to them. Some of your fields won't show that linear trend because they're not a linear trend. We just don't show them those ones. It's just, we explain it to the level that they need.
Just to say, there is a whole load of things now in explainable AI which calculate SHAP scores, which is linearly additive for each feature, and that might be what I mean. That's kind of we had a talk on it again pre-COVID. I thought it was very interesting. Sorry, there's one last one before the final question that I want. Last couple. Can customers request looking at models to see whether a loan application was rejected? I guess that falls under GDPR. I don't think they can.
All right. So, well, for start, our models don't reject anybody, so I don't have to worry about that. All our models say is, who should we send an email saying, hey, do you know Bank of Ireland does loans? But in terms of that, I don't think that's, and I'm not an expert, but as far as I know, I don't think that's one of the pieces of information you have to show them in terms of, now, if somebody was to come in and say, why did I get this email about a personal loan? And sometimes the question comes back to us, go and say, look, this customer came in, she's 65 and she got an email for a first-time buyer mortgage. That doesn't sound right. Okay. So that's sometimes stuff comes comes back to us that way. So frontline staff has kind of said, look, this doesn't seem to make sense. And we'll obviously look at it and go, do you know, that doesn't make sense. Let's have a look and see why they're in there. But I haven't had the experience of where customers have kind of come back in and asked, and the questions come to us to say why. Have they? I think like the banks tend to be quite cautious. And in fairness, my experience, the two banks I've worked in, there's very much a customer focus. So, you know, when we're building models, the question will be asked, sometimes by us, sometimes by others, you know, are customers expecting this? Are we going to be creating a score for something that they're just not expecting at all? And if they got an email from us and it turns out that they were targeted by a model, would they be horrified? And if yes, well, then we're not building it, you know. So there is that focus on customer expectation as well.
Right. Cool. And then the final one, which I think is an excellent question, Paddy, is how many units departments have to be involved to have prod models succeed, and how do you manage them?
What was it? How many
like units, departments within the organization? Like how far does that consultation or involvement, like for it to succeed and to get that, you know, like how big does your stakeholder net have to be cast? Which I think is a great question because I don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah. So what I found from building a number of models is that we'd often have the business experts, right? So the people who know that product inside out. But you need the people who know the business aspect of the problem, but also the data aspect of the product. And that's probably just somebody more junior. So you've got the head of the department who knows how loans work, and then you've got Joe who knows how the loans data is. But then also in your stakeholder group, we would have somebody from the contact. So however this is going to be used, they're in right from the beginning. So a lot of our models are used then by a team who either make phone calls or send emails. And often what happens is the business talk to us, they forget to talk to the contact team, and then we've built the model and the contact team goes, we've no capacity. So to avert that, we try to get that team as one of the stakeholders right at the beginning. If it's a particularly complex model build, or it's going to be a completely different, not even an algorithm, but say a model that's a multi-stage model. So we're going to build model A that runs, and the customers from model A go into model B, right? Multi-stage. Then we'd probably have somebody from the production team as a stakeholder. Maybe they don't need to come to every meeting, but we would be consulting them right from the beginning and saying, look, we think this is going to be quite a different type of deployment. It's something you haven't deployed before. We want to make sure that you're involved from the beginning, more so for awareness, and they can kind of throw up any issues we need to consider, rather than us just developing something that they've never seen before and then handing it over and saying, can you productionize that? The other stakeholders we'd tend to have then maybe would be from a marketing department. So you might have the business experts, but also the marketing experts who know about the propositions that are on offer. And particularly if it's for a new proposition, they might be your primary stakeholder rather than the business experts. But that's the groups we've gone with. You do run the risk if you have a very large stakeholder group, it can be more unmanageable. So the way we've dealt with that is by having kind of formal touch points. So you have a kickoff session where you get everybody in and we ask questions and they do most of the talking. Then you've got that problem definition phase where we've taken it away and we come back and we say, okay, in English, we think this is your target and these are the criteria for exclusion or inclusion to the base. And we put it to them and they either say, well, hang on, we think you also need to include something about an income filter, or we think the age is too wide or something like that, or they sign off on it. And until they sign off on it, we don't start building anything. So I think having formal touch points that's changed how we build models, because the business, they've signed off, you've made them focus on what's in front of them and say, these are the only criteria we're considering. If you want another criterion there, now is the time to say it. Otherwise, the model's going to be built on this. it's kind of a process that I've come to organically by having meetings with business stakeholders, and then they change their mind, and you're, I should have got that in writing initially, and then you go back and you change that process.
Well, it's the old adage that there's no substitute for experience. You only learn that through going through it.
Yeah.
No amount of book reading or book learning can teach that kind of stuff. You know, with apologies to Flavia because we've gone way over, but there's one last question and then we're going to stop. From Greg, have you ever told a customer their ask is a no-go? Like they've came to you about building a model and for whatever reason, the data or whatever, does that happen? I presume the answer to that is a yes, but how often?
Not too often, but so one big reason recently that we've had to say no is data just wasn't available. So they wanted to build it for a product. That data is not in the data warehouse. So then rather than just going back with a no, we've gone back and said, look, it's not in the data warehouse. If you can get it into the data warehouse, we'll look at building a model.
Yeah.
The thing that we do more is that problem definition bit that I mentioned. So when we go back to the business and we say, here's the target, here's the population, part of that process on our side is to build a benchmark model to make sure we can actually model it. Because and again, this comes from experience, going back to the business saying, yeah, we can definitely build that for you. And then we try and build the model and the prior probability was just too low. There's not enough targets. You couldn't build a model. And then we had to go back and say, look, we'll give you some rules instead. Here's some insights, build some business rules. So now what we do is when we go back with that problem definition that we call it, we say to them, yes, we think this is suitable for a model, or maybe it's suitable for 3 models. We think we should segment them and build 3 different populations. Or we go back and say, it's just not possible to model on this. We need either change significantly what you want to model, or we'll just give you some business rules that'll do as a substitute.
Cool. Okay, thank you very much. Flavia, we will finally let you go. You've been very patient. Thank you very much. Fiona, thank you very much. That was excellent. I think I've mentioned that people can share, you're willing to share their slides.
Yeah.
So I will post a link to that probably on Meetup and maybe LinkedIn tomorrow. I generally put it on a Google Drive or something with the file. But yeah, we will have a workshop in July and August, and then we will probably have a talk in September. And I see your point, by the way, about explainable AI. That's probably going to be a workshop before the end of the year, Des. I've just realized that's something I've been meaning to do for a while. So your question has kind of gone on it. Yeah, so back to Flavia. Thank you very much. And to everyone at Dogpatch, and especially Flavia for being stuck in her kitchen until 9 on this. Thank God I don't feel too guilty because it's not a nice day out. If it was a nice day, I would feel very guilty indeed. But thank you for everything and thank you for always hosting us. Oh, you can't unmute. Okay. Excellent. That's the perfect round off to the night. Thank you for everything. And yeah, I guess we'll leave it there and we will we'll see you next month. Just keep an eye on Meetup and on LinkedIn. And yeah, we'll be back soon. Talk to you then. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.